Hello again, everybody. This will be our first content lecture with PowerPoint semester, first of many, as it were. And we're going to start with World War I, and that's not where the 20th century starts, but that's where we're going to start. And what we want to start with is a map, right? Because we love maps, and this is what Europe looks like today, and in 1913 it does. So this is just sort of the borders are not the same. See Austria-Hungary here, that's a country that no longer exists. Romania is spelled different now. Bulgaria is still there, but it's different borders. Serbia has different borders. Germany has different borders. You'll notice that there's no Poland in here, or Lithuania, or Estonia, or some of those eastern countries. Ukraine isn't there. Belarus isn't there. So this is what the map of Europe looks like at the time. The Western Europe looks pretty much the same. You got your Low Countries, France, Great Britain, and some of these Scandinavian countries are pretty much the same. But this is what the world looks like in 1913 before the war starts. That's what the map of Europe looks like and these national boundaries. Now, each of these major countries before World War One had a reason that they wanted to go to war, and they had been preparing for war for a long time now for a couple of reasons, and we'll get into in a second. But to start with, each of these great powers had their reasons. Germany, they want to go to war. They think that the way to unify the country, and they'd only been unified for a little while now, since the late 19th century, was through war, and that's the way to unify the country. And France had been humiliated by one of those wars of unification Germany conducted a couple decades before in the late 19th century, so they wanted a little bit of revenge against Germany for themselves. Great Britain at this point is interested in protecting themselves and their overseas trading empire. At this point, they own, and you have to say own in air quotes, places as far ranging from islands in the Pacific Ocean to some Indonesian islands to India and places elsewhere. So they are interested in protecting their own trading interests. Austria-Hungary has some internal conflict going on, and if we compare the map we just looked at to a map of today, we'll notice that there's probably close to 20 or so countries in the modern world that are all under this Austro-Hungarian Empire at the point. So there's a lot of ethnic tensions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they have some internal conflict going on, and one way to combat internal conflict is to find an external threat, and in this case, going to war with one of these other countries would be a big external threat that they could unify behind. Russia, for their part, now Russia's interest in the Balkans is that ethnically they are similar, and Russia has some treaties with places like Serbia, which we saw in the map of Europe. So they have defense treaties with Serbia that they have to keep in mind as war is coming closer. Italy, also like Germany, a recently unified country, they want some recognition on the international stage. They hadn't always been unified as a single state as they are by the late 19th century, and they do want some recognition from other major European powers. So now we're going to go over 5 major causes for the start of World War One. The war was, in some instances, inevitable, and there's been a lot of historical argument about whether or not the war actually was inevitable, but for our purposes, we're going to consider that it was inevitable for these 5 reasons, and we'll start with alliances. On the one side, we have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy initially, but you'll notice that changes about halfway through the war when Italy switches sides, just because they switch sides sometimes, and the Ottoman Empire takes over in that Triple Alliance. You'll also hear this alliance called the Central Powers sometimes because, if you'll notice, they are sort of centered in between these other countries. So those are the Central Powers of the Triple Alliance. On the other side, we have the Triple Entente, and remember that Entente is a French word, so it's the French are involved in this alliance along with Great Britain and Russia. And mostly these are defensive alliances. These countries promise to protect each other if somebody else attacks one of them. And now I have this sort of flow chart, or what do you call this, a pie chart, some kind of chart, just when these alliances were formed, at what point, and what kind of alliance they are. So you see that Italy has alliances with Austria-Hungary and Germany. That breaks about halfway through the war. Again, the Ottoman Empire comes in there. Bulgaria is sort of split in the middle here, same with Serbia, but then Russia and France and Great Britain, they all have their alliance together. You'll notice that Great Britain jumped in a little bit late to this alliance game, and there's a good reason for that, because Great Britain really didn't want to pick sides because they were way more interested in conducting business overseas with their foreign trading empire. So this is our first major cause of the war, is these defensive alliances, which sort of guaranteed that every country involved would be involved if there was a war, and the war, again, was probably inevitable. Nationalism was becoming a major idea towards the 20th century and the late 19th century. For thousands of years, people didn't necessarily identify with their nation states. They would identify more on the local level. So for sort of a close to home example, before the Civil War in the United States, we probably would have identified as North Carolinians before we ever identified, or whatever states you're from, would have identified as North Carolinians before we identified as Americans, and that changes sort of after the Civil War. And in Europe, it's the same thing. There are these ideas going around in the middle of the 1800s. We get to these revolutions in 1848, wherein nationalism becomes a much bigger deal, and Germany and Italy had just unified, so they're pretty big on nationalism. This also extends to Great Britain and Russia and France and Italy too. And the ideas behind nationalism is giving your life for the state. So your life belongs to the state. We don't mean a state like North Carolina. We mean a state like on the national level. For us, it would be the United States. In early 20th century Europe, it would have been Germany or Great Britain or one of these great powers. Education is becoming a much bigger deal, and we mean public education in most cases. And part of public education is indoctrinating students into that country's way of life. And I have a close to home example of that one. Most of us, probably all of us, remember saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day in elementary and middle school, and I guess high school too. That is an instance of nationalism through education, through state-funded education. And what else we have here are the Slavic nations. And most Slavic nations, those are Eastern European countries who are under one of these great powers. In most cases, it's Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, and they really want their own smaller nation. And I mean, it's no spoiler because we know what the map of Europe looks like today. They achieve that independence eventually. It takes a long time, but these Slavic nations are becoming a little bit more nationalistic. Militarism had also become a much bigger deal as we're getting into the 20th century. And what we mean by militarism is the buildup of the military complex within a country. The Industrial Revolution has an awful lot to do with this. We know the Industrial Revolution began much, much earlier. 1750 is kind of the date that we put on it. It's sort of an arbitrary date. But the revolution really gets going with steam power, with iron, steel making, and that's all becoming more and more apparent as the 20th century, as we're turning into the 20th century. So we get to this period of an arms race. Now the arms race is a buildup of mostly guns and artillery pieces and bullets and stuff that you would need to make war. Tanks come along a little bit later in the war. There's a naval buildup as part of this arms race between mostly it's Germany and Great Britain here competing to see who can have the bigger navy. Conscription goes along with militarism and nationalism. And with conscription, it's the draft, and that's being conscripted into the nation's army. Germany would have a conscription draft. Great Britain eventually, actually, Great Britain didn't have a draft. France had a draft, though. Russia had a conscription draft. So this is all part of militarism, which is another of these major causes of World War I. Economic imperialism is a big deal, too. Colonies is what we're talking about here. And I have just this map of Africa, but it also extends into Asia, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. We'll get into imperialism in Africa and Asia in more depth, but you'll notice here that Africa is split up between these major European powers, and it's about economics. Great Britain, they have sort of this long chain from north to south so they can access any point of the country or continent that they need to. This happens in Asia too, wherein Europeans take over areas in Asia that they exploit for their economic benefits. The Balkans is also, this is southeastern Europe. Think of where modern day Bulgaria is and Greece, and that region down there, that's the Balkans. So there's spheres of influence down towards the Balkans too. So this is another of these major causes of World War I. The final one we're going to look at here is the media, and we're talking about newspapers. And in these newspapers, there's an awful lot of propaganda, and literacy as a big cause for this one, because people with that public education, lots more people are able to read and read the newspapers especially. So there are state-run newspapers that are instilling nationalism and justifying the militarism and the economic imperialism in these European countries. So this is the last of our major causes of World War I. And the example picture we have is this placard. It's the United States placard, and it's talking destroy this mad brute. And the brute is militarism here. That's Germany. You can see by the pointy hat. Influence the rest of Europe by smashing their culture into everything. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about propaganda. So if we come back to this map of Europe, before World War I starts, we can sort of see who's who in Europe, and you'll notice that most of these North African countries, those are ruled. Over here, it's mostly France. Over here, it's mostly Great Britain ruling those areas. But in mainland Europe itself, you can see, so there's sort of the split here. The Triple Entente here. Italy switched sides about halfway through the war. We'll get into that in a minute. And then Russia on this side. But there's also these, this is where the Balkans is. These Balkan countries joined sides in this war. So here's our Central Powers. Notice, because they're in the center, Italy was part of the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, but then they switched sides. So this is who's who as we're going into it. You'll notice Netherlands, they try to stay neutral. Some of these Scandinavian countries try to stay neutral. Switzerland always is neutral. Spain, they don't take sides. So this is kind of who's going in to World War I. And we've talked about all these reasons that the war was sort of inevitable, but it definitely needed a spark to get going. And that spark happens on June 28th, 1914, when this guy, the Archduke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, his name is Franz Ferdinand, he was assassinated by this guy, Gavrilo Princip. He's a member of this terrorist organization or nationalist organization, depending on who you talk to, called the Black Hand. And you might be thinking, well, why does he have sandwiches on there? And the reason that the Archduke is assassinated is because Gavrilo was getting a sandwich. And the story here is that the Archduke was scheduled to tour Sarajevo, the city in Serbia. Sarajevo spelled not like it sounds, Sarajevo. Sarajevo, he was scheduled to tour there, and he was going on this tour. The Black Hand, this terrorist or nationalist organization, knew about it, and they sent out 5 assassins to take out the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand. And what ends up happening is a couple of them, 2 of the assassins got scared and didn't do anything at all. 2 others ended up throwing a grenade at the Archduke's carriage, but it doesn't explode on his carriage. It exploded on a carriage that was in the route with him. And so that carriage has to go to the hospital, and a couple of officers were injured. Well, Franz Ferdinand decides to detour because he wants to go to the hospital and visit the injured officers before he continues on with his day. So his driver got a little lost because he wasn't super familiar with the streets of Sarajevo. So as they're doing that, Gavrilo Princip, who was the last guy sort of in the line here, he figured that the Archduke wasn't coming. So what he ended up doing was he was hungry, so he went to a sandwich shop. And while he was waiting in line to get a sandwich, the Archduke's carriage rode by him. And Gavrilo saw him, jumped out, and shot him and his wife, Sofia. And that's where this Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, dies. His wife ends up dying too. Gavrilo had a cyanide capsule that was supposed to kill him, and so he bit down on the cyanide capsule, and it turns out, and I don't know how this is possible, but poison expires. Well, the poison had expired, so he just threw up, but he tried to jump into a river to drown himself, and he ended up not drowning, so he was captured, but he was too young to be executed by the Austrians, so he ends up dying in jail. He caught a disease while he was in jail. It happens during the war. So what happens here is that Austria-Hungary ends up blaming Serbia for the whole thing, and after this sort of long, complicated situation, invades Serbia a little while later. Even though the Serbs didn't necessarily approve of this organization, the Black Hand, they were blamed in general for it. So what happens is that Russia has close ethnic, religious, and political ties to Serbia. They are allied with Serbia. But there's something to keep in mind, is that the Russian army was poorly trained, it was poorly armed, but it was rather massive in general. So Austria has some demands of Serbia, and they issue this ultimatum with a bunch of demands that we're not going to go through all of. But Serbia, who is backed by Russia, isn't all that keen on adhering to the ultimatum. But something else of interest is that Austria sort of knew that Serbia would be able to live up to the expectations of the ultimatum. Austria, who is allied with Germany, asked Germany whether or not this was okay, and they got sort of a vague response back, which has become known as this blank check. And blank check, sort of what it sounds like. Germany said, "Go ahead, do whatever," and Austria took that to mean, "Sure, it's okay to invade." Meanwhile, the Tsar of Russia, and that just means leader. Tsar is Russianized version to say Caesar, so that means sort of emperor or leader there. So that's the Tsar of Russia, and then the Kaiser, on the other hand, that is the German way to say Caesar. So these are just titles here. So the Tsar and the Kaiser mobilized their countries. The Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany mobilized their countries for war. Britain wanted to try to work this out diplomatically, but that doesn't work. So then we start in with this thing called the Schlieffen Plan, which I'll explain in a slide or two. But before we get into the Schlieffen Plan, I want to explain a little bit about European monarchies. So we talked about the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany. Well, they were actually cousins, and they're also cousins with the King of England at the time. And the way this works is that they're all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, who was, think about the Victorian age in England. We're thinking about Queen Victoria. So Victoria and England had grandchildren, and monarchies stick with other monarchies, and that's how you end up with crazy monarchs who end up peeing blue, or they have this thing called a Habsburg jaw, where it's this family jaw that's just gross in general from the Habsburgs. But these are different ones. These are Hanovers. So Queen Victoria has these grandchildren. In England, it becomes George V is the king there. In Germany, it's Kaiser Wilhelm II. He is cousin to George V, who is also cousin to the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II. So they are all related. I think that's sort of an interesting fact to keep in mind. In Russia and Germany, the Tsar and the Kaiser have a lot more power than the King of England does. Remember, England at this point is more democratic than most countries in Europe. And they have prime minister and parliament to answer to first. But back to the Schlieffen Plan. So it's developed by this guy. He's a general called Schlieffen. His plan is that they would leave Germany, and this is Germany, would leave a small defensive force against Russia because they knew the Russian army was huge, but they knew that they weren't ready yet. They're poorly armed and poorly trained, and they thought they could hold them off. And within 6 weeks, their plan was to invade France, and follow along with the mouse here, through Belgium, using Luxembourg here as a pivot point, and they would sweep in and capture the capital. And for centuries, the idea is that if you capture the capital of a country, that country should then, it's over, it surrenders, it falls. So they would envelop Paris and then defeat the French within a month, hoping that Great Britain would also be too slow to react in that time. Then they would put most of their army that was fighting in France on trains and send them across Germany to finally invade Russia. And the idea here is that you could win the war all within a couple of weeks, a month or two at most. The French counterplan was Plan 17, which is kind of complicated, but we'll skip over that for now. What ends up happening is that the Schlieffen Plan doesn't work. Russia reacts a lot more quickly than Germany had expected. Germany ends up missing Paris by 15 miles, and France ends up mobilizing along the Marne River. The Marne River is just this river up here in northern France. They mobilize there, and they are able to stop the German advance. And when we get this sort of stalemate where neither side is winning clearly, both sides dig in, and we get what's known as trench warfare. Trench warfare begins on the Western Front and continues for the next 4 years. And if we look at some maps of Europe during the war, we'll notice that there's a trench line up and down the entire continent. So we have this illustration up here of what the trench lines might have looked like or did look like. It's sort of an overhead view. You dig a couple of trenches you have your front line, and you have some support trenches and reserve trenches behind those. And this was sort of how trench warfare worked. In the middle, you have what's known as no man's land, so named because if you go there, you're probably going to die. Usually 25 yards or so, up to a mile wide. So that's no man's land. You don't want to get stuck in no man's land. And this is sort of how it continues. There are offensives on both sides, and things do change a little bit, but the majority of the war, the trench lines remain almost the same. And since we can't go over every battle in the war, I'm just going to pick out some of the highlights that I want to talk about from the war, starting with this first one here at the bottom. And this is the first place that chemical warfare ever takes place. Debatable, but we can talk about that at a different time if you want to. But this battle is called the Battle of Ypres, and I know it looks like it says Ypres. That's pronounced Ypres. British people didn't know how to pronounce it, so they called it Wipers. So there's a number of ways to say this. This is just the first place that chemical warfare starts. But it's not just an on-land war. There's a naval component to it. The British Navy, keep in mind, is greater than the German Navy. There is one major battle on sea between battleships on top of the sea, and that happens at this place called Jutland, Jutland, and that is actually up here closer to the Danish coast. And the Battle of Jutland is an overwhelming British victory, and afterwards Germany doesn't want to risk their fleet anymore, so they keep most of their surface ships in ports for the rest of the war, and they move towards this submarine style warfare. You might have heard of U-boats before. This is where they're first being really used on large scale. And so these submarines, as directed by Germany, they employ this tactic called unrestricted submarine warfare, which is a major reason the United States gets involved in the war later on, because the British Navy, the surface fleet, was much better than the German surface fleet, so they moved to this unrestricted submarine warfare style using submarines. There are mines in the North Sea. This is the North Sea up here. So the German Navy really can't get out. Only these U-boats can. And so that's kind of what's going on in the naval hemisphere. And these U-boats, they would hunt down ships around the Atlantic because they could get out, even though surface ships can't get out. They hunt down cargo ships, supply ships, any kind of ship taking something to England, and that's going to become a big deal later on. Now that brings us to the Ottoman Empire, which is sometimes known as the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire had existed for several centuries to this point, and you'll notice, according to this map, that it used to be a lot bigger than it was by the time of 1914. They had lost a lot of territory to France and Great Britain mostly, and some places, Austria-Hungary and Russia. So they were losing for a long time. That's why they're known as the sick man of Europe. They do favor the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, for a couple of reasons, mostly because they do not get along with Russia at all. Russia, during the wintertime, if we imagine up here, it becomes really icy. They can't get their navy out during the wintertime, so they need a warm water port on the Atlantic coast, and the way they can do that is through the Black Sea here. There's these two little channels here called the Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits, where they could get out from mainland Russia. So the Ottomans, for that reason, aren't big fans of Russia, so they don't get along all that well. So that's one of the reasons that they do favor the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, during this war. So the German ships do sail under Ottoman flags and fire at Russia at one point, and that's around here, around these straits, and that's really what gets the Ottomans involved in the war. That's a little bit after the start of the war, but not that much longer. Elsewhere, airplanes are becoming a big deal for the first time in warfare. For a little while, towards the beginning of the war, people don't know how to use airplanes in war. They use them as reconnaissance planes for a little while once they figure it out. But we also, not just planes, we have these Zeppelins too. These rather large and unwieldy machines that go through the air, and you think that it's rather easy to blow them up. It's not as easy as it looks. They're not just these big helium balloons. There's a series of balloons inside that keeps them in the air. And what they're used for a lot is reconnaissance and for bombing, because bomber planes are developed later in the war, but at the beginning of the war, they're not quite as prominent. Fighter planes are another big deal, because when you have the other side taking reconnaissance of your trench lines, you would send out fighter planes to shoot them down. So we get this sort of mythology that develops around the Knights of the Air, because you're not fighting on horseback all that often anymore, even though cavalry warfare does exist during World War I. So we get these knights of the air, sort of this mythology that develops around them. On the one side, sort of the most famous German knight in the air is this guy Manfred von Richthofen, who you probably know better as the guy who makes pizzas, the Red Baron. He's the best known of the German aces. On the English side, we have Eddie Rickenbacker. I say English, I meant American side, we have Eddie Rickenbacker, who was probably one of the most famous aces on the Allied side, on the Triple Entente side of the war. So that's what's going on as far as air power is concerned. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, if we just zoom in here a little bit, this is sort of zoomed into the Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits down here. This is the way to get from the Black Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Mediterranean first, and then to the Atlantic Ocean. You'll see here Pillars of Heracles. That's sort of an old mythological, the ends of the earth sort of thing, but that's really where Asia and Europe divide themselves, if we're gonna put a geographical spot on it. So you just make a note of that in your head. So back here, we're getting to this big battle called Gallipoli. And this is Great Britain along with their sort of allies, sort of dominion, Australia and New Zealand. They decide to invade the Ottomans to try and take them out of the war. And what ends up happening is this massive failure. So they go in thinking that if they take over these straits, they can prevent the Ottomans from being very effective for the rest of the war and maybe take them out altogether. But this battle at Gallipoli turns out to be a massive failure with large casualties on the British and Australian and New Zealander side of it. And it keeps, the Ottomans keep the straits and they stay in the war actually until the end. And what ends up happening is now that Great Britain is fighting on two fronts because they have to fight the Ottomans here in this Mediterranean region, and they also are fighting on mainland Europe in that trench warfare that we looked at a minute ago. Italy, for their part, they end up switching sides in the middle of the war, and it has to do with territorial disputes. They're having some massive territorial disputes with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they enter the London Pact and decide to switch sides under the understanding that they will take some of this territory that they want from the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the war is over. Other big battles, because we can't do all of them, the Battle of Verdun is one of the biggest ones. It ends up being a 10-month battle with 650 soldiers dead, not just casualties, but dead. And sort of the main theme here is that no progress was made on either side, despite 10 months of fighting and over half a million soldiers being dead. The next big battle here is the Battle of the Somme. It's named after the Somme River in northern France. What's significant here is it's a huge battle, and the artillery barrage, there starts an artillery barrage, and we have an example here of what would be barraging the enemy. Could be felt as far away as London. So from mainland France, you could hear the artillery, feel the artillery in the ground as far away as London. This battle ends up lasting 4.5 months. The British gain only 6 miles for a cost of 310,000 soldiers dead on both sides. So this is just sort of illustrating with these giant battles, sort of a lot of death with very little progress in terms of territory taken or land taken. And here we have a map. You can see, so this is the Somme, and you'll notice that there's England right there. So, not that far, but still pretty far. And this is the Battle of Verdun. If we went back a couple of maps ago, which we won't do, talk about the Battle of the Marne, putting some mythology in here too, because there's not, there's some truth to it, but not a ton of truth to it. The first major engagement on the western fronts of this war was at the Battle of the Marne, and one of the fun stories, I guess it's fun out of here, is that France couldn't shuttle enough soldiers to the front lines, to the Marne River. So what they end up doing is hiring Parisian taxis, so taxis in Paris, to ferry soldiers to the front. And it's just one of these fun sort of myths that comes out of the war. And there's some truth to it, but not, entirely. So what we get is this long period of stalemate. And the war turns into a war of attrition more than anything, because nobody can really gain territory on either side. You notice the Battle of the Somme, which is a 4.5 month long battle, you only gain 6 miles of territory. And nothing really breaks through until 1917 at this Battle of Passchendaele, where we get some major British progress for the first time in 3 years. Machine guns and gas are some of these new inventions of war that helped. We talked about the Battle of Ypres, where the first place that gas was used happened, and just to put some context in it, originally gas wasn't loaded into artillery shells. It was just they were in canisters, and you would open them up, and hopefully the wind was blowing in the right direction for your side. Later on in the war, they become a little bit more efficient, and I like these pictures here because you can see their gas masks. They look kind of terrifying, but here's some doggies who also have gas masks on, which is adorable. Machine guns are being employed for the first time. You might have heard of a Gatling gun before. Those weren't widespread until World War I, these machine gun style weapons. Here's another map that sort of illustrates the line, marks the line where most of the fighting here takes place. Other notable notes that come out of World War I is this guy, who you might not initially recognize, but as soon as I tell you who he was, you'll know who it is. That's Adolf Hitler. He was in the German army. He's actually Austrian by birth, but I'll explain that in another PowerPoint. So he's Austrian by birth, but he ends up joining the German army because he's ethnically a German. He does fight. He's actually a well-decorated member of the German army. Elsewhere, the United States is still existing. They don't get involved in the war until 1917. They are neutral at first for a couple of reasons, but mostly because one section of the country, actually a large section of the country, does want to remain sort of this as an isolationist country. Yeah, so the United States does remain neutral for a long time, but there are two major reasons that the United States eventually gets involved. And one of those was that unrestricted submarine warfare that we talked about with the German submarines, the German U-boats. They had been sinking a couple of, or actually a lot of British vessels, but other vessels too. This, you might have heard of the Lusitania before. The Lusitania sunk by one of these German U-boats that ended up killing a number of American citizens, even though Germany had been taking out ads in places like the New York Times telling Americans not to ride on British ships. And the Lusitania happened to be a British ship, but Americans, cavalier as ever, decided to do it anyway. So over 100 Americans are killed. That actually happens in 1915, but it's the first example, the best example of this unrestricted submarine warfare taking its toll on civilians, because this was more of a civilian liner. Later on, decades later, we found out that the Lusitania was actually carrying ammunition and shells for the British from place to place, and that's what the Germans were saying, is like they're carrying ammunition. The British denied it for close to a century, but later on we found out that they actually were carrying ammunition on their ship. The other major reason the United States gets involved in the First World War is this thing called the Zimmermann telegram, and I have a map here. The Zimmermann telegram was a telegram from this guy, Ambassador Zimmermann. He was German, ambassador to Mexico, and the German High Command had telegrammed him saying that he should make an alliance with Mexico, asking Mexico to invade the United States if they should get involved in World War I. And it's looking a little bit more and more as we get closer to the end of the war that the United States is going to join on the side of Great Britain and France and Russia. So they kind of want to preempt that by getting Mexico involved. Mexico actually, as we know, doesn't get involved, but it wasn't that unheard of at the time. If you're familiar with Pancho Villa at all, he had been sort of a thorn in the side of Southern America for a little while towards 1916, 1917-ish. So the Zimmermann telegram was another big deal. It had been intercepted by the British, and the British were all too happy to translate it and give it to the United States. Some minor reasons for the United States getting involved in the First World War is that Woodrow Wilson, the president of the U.S. at the time, and Congress in general do favor Great Britain and France in terms of trade, because they have a lot more, a bigger ability to trade with the United States than does Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these are some of the reasons that the United States gets involved, and they do end up getting involved in 1917. And they enter Europe finally on April 6th. Woodrow Wilson asks for a declaration of war. And what they end up using is this convoy system, which becomes a little bit more prominent during World War II, but that's later to this point. Unrestricted submarine warfare was very costly to the Allies, and one way to combat that was through the system of convoy. And you would group your ships together, making it harder for these submarines to sink them. And what else the arrival of the United States into the war does is it provides a fresh supply of new soldiers. At this point, by 1917, the Europeans had been fighting for several years, and most of them are exhausted. So we get these fresh soldiers who are good to go, but they're also very inexperienced. They're led by General John Pershing. He's an American general. They're called doughboys for some hilarious reasons. And what we have here are these convoy routes leaving from Canada, as part of the British Empire, had been involved for a while. We get these convoy routes from the United States, Boston and New York here. This is what a convoy would look like. So just a bunch of ships going together, and this would be an image of a doughboy. That's a U.S. soldier fighting in the war. Oops. The United States enters the war with some ideas in mind about how the world should look after the war is over. And these 14 points, what's known as the 14 points, is the U.S. president's idea for the end of the war. This is President Woodrow Wilson. Point one combats, remember, the causes of the war. Alliances was a big deal. A lot of them were done through secret treaties. So point one calls for no more secret treaties. Point two and three, they're talking about freedom of the seas and free trade. Point two is to combat that unrestricted submarine warfare, saying that we can't do that anymore. Free trade has a lot to do with, so this part has to do with trading around the world, just keeping trade open around the world. That way the United States wouldn't have to pick sides between trading with Great Britain or Germany moving forward. Point four is disarmament, and that goes to combat that militarism, the buildup before the war of this large arms race. 5 through 13 have a lot to do with self-determination in Europe, talking about democracy for some of these individual countries that are involved under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. You'll notice that it's talking about self-determination in Europe, but not elsewhere, and we'll get into that as we go along. Think of Vietnam later on. I'll talk about Ho Chi Minh when we get there. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam during the Vietnam War, was at the peace conference here, but there's no self-determination for Asia. And the 14th point is this League of Nations, and the League of Nations is sort of the precursor to the United Nations, which emerges after World War II. So this is the United States' plan for the end of the war. We're not quite done with the war yet, but this is Wilson's plan. So Russia, by 1917, about the same time that the United States is ready to enter the war, is done. Like, they can't handle it anymore. The war was increasingly unpopular. So we get finally this revolution, and there's actually a series of revolutions. The first one is the February Revolution, which probably most of us completely forgot about until we get to the Bolshevik Revolution, led by this guy, Vladimir Lenin, who was hiding in Germany because the Tsar didn't like him because he was a revolutionary. Germany helped him get back to Russia to foment revolutionary ideals. And by November 26th, by November 26th, the Russians pull out. The Bolsheviks are in charge of Russia at this point, and they make their own separate peace with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and they are out of the war. And when we say Bolsheviks, that is a Russian word. You'll hear Bolshevism or Bolsheviks as we go along in this course, and that's talking about the Communist Party in Russia. Bolshevik means majority. The other is Menshevik. They would have been the opposition. Those are the minority. So when we're talking about those words, that's what they mean. Bolshevik is majority. It just means the majority party in the Soviet Union. So now, with the exit of the Russians, close to 1 million soldiers are now available to go west to fight on the Western Front, but both sides are exhausted from fighting. Germany ends up trying to make one more big push for Paris, but the United States slowly enters and stops Germany. The United States does have a lot to do with the outcome of the war, influencing the outcome of the war. So they enter and they stop Germany. There is an influenza outbreak, that's the Spanish flu, which ends up killing more people than the war itself actually had killed. So the U.S. shows up and shifts the momentum. There are massive mutinies. That means people mutinying against their own officers in some of these Central Power armies. That's Germany and Austria-Hungary. So Germany ends up asking for a ceasefire. At first, they just wanted to take a break, but the Western side, the Triple Entente, which is now the United States, Great Britain, France, and actually Italy, they decide that this should lead to the end of the war, and that's what ends up happening. So we get to this Paris Peace Conference, wherein it's decided, the Treaty of Versailles decides the end of the war, and it really sets the stage for World War II. So that's probably it for World War One. We covered it in 40 minutes, which seems like quite a short amount of time for such a large topic, and you're right, it is. So I will see you on the next video.